I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. Molly had always been my compass. From the moment we met at a mutual friend's party, there was an unspoken understanding between us. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room just by walking in, and from the first time she looked at me with those mischievous eyes, I was hooked. 10 years of marriage only deepened that bond, or so I thought. Over the years, we had built a life that felt solid, a steady job for each of us, a close-knit group of friends, and our cherished routines. We had our occasional fights, sure, but what couple doesn't? Things started to shift, though. It was subtle at first, a missed call here, a late night out there. Molly worked as a chartered accountant, and she often had to travel for work. I'd always been supportive, even proud of her ambition, so I never questioned it when she said she'd be gone for a night or two. But in the past few months, her trips seemed more frequent, her time at home more distracted. One evening, as we were settling down for dinner, she mentioned a new colleague, Nick. She described him in casual terms, just a coworker who'd joined the team, helping her with some high-stakes accounts. I nodded along, happy to hear her chat about work, but there was something in her tone that left a trace of doubt in my mind. She spoke about him with an energy that seemed out of place. At the time, I chalked it up to excitement over a new project or maybe just the way she animated herself with her storytelling. The following week, we were out with friends, and I noticed something strange. She was more glued to her phone than usual, laughing at messages and typing furiously between bites of dinner. I made a light-hearted comment about her mysterious pen pal, but she brushed it off with a laugh, claiming she was just keeping up with work emails. In the past, this would have been the end of it, I trusted her implicitly. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and every little thing seemed to water it. About a month later, Molly announced a last-minute weekend trip to attend a financial conference. She seemed almost too eager to go, as if the trip had been some long-awaited vacation instead of another business obligation. Watching her pack, I realized just how much I had come to take these trips for granted. Still, something in the way she folded each outfit carefully, her deliberate choice of perfumes and shoes, it felt different. I told myself I was imagining things, but part of me wondered if there was more to this trip than she was letting on. The night she left, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her side of the bed felt cold and unusually empty, and my mind kept spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from me, something fundamental to the life we had built. By the time she returned, I'd convinced myself that my worries were baseless, chalking them up to a mix of sleepless nights and my own insecurities. But then, something happened that changed everything. One evening, a few weeks after her return, we decided to grab dinner at a restaurant we loved. It was the kind of place where we'd spent countless Friday nights, and the familiarity was comforting. We were halfway through our meal when her phone, resting face up on the table, buzzed loudly. I glanced over at it, a reflex more than anything, and noticed that the message wasn't work-related. It was from Nick. I tried to hide my reaction, but she must have noticed something because she quickly flipped her phone over and forced a smile. She gave some excuse about work, but I could feel a slight tremor in her voice. My heart pounded as I processed what I'd seen. Nick's name shouldn't have been on her screen at 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, especially with a message that began with, "Can't wait to see you." I kept my face neutral, pushing down the boiling frustration that was starting to cloud my thoughts. I wanted to ask her about it, but I knew that if I confronted her now, it would lead to a massive argument that would ruin the night, and maybe it was just my imagination running wild again. I had been wrong before, I reminded myself. So, I swallowed my suspicion and pretended not to notice. I watched her carefully for the rest of the night, though, noting every glance she gave her phone, every text she sent under the table when she thought I wasn't looking. The following days passed in a haze of doubt and suspicion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, but I didn't have proof, only my gut and a growing number of half-caught glances at her phone. I began observing her habits more closely. Whenever she announced another trip or an evening out with friends, I noted the times she left and returned, the details she gave and the little inconsistencies in her stories. One morning, I got my chance. She was running late for work, a rarity for her, and in her rush, she left her phone on the kitchen counter. I felt a pang of guilt as I reached for it, but my curiosity overpowered any reservations I had. Unlocking her phone, I found her messages with Nick at the top of her recent chats. The messages confirmed my worst fears: dates, times, places. They had been meeting secretly for months. A rush of anger washed over me, a mixture of betrayal and humiliation. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner, for trusting her so completely. As I skimmed through the messages, a plan started forming in my mind. If she wanted to play this game, then I'd make sure she'd regret it. That night, I pretended everything was normal. I kissed her goodnight, held her close, and listened to her tell me about her day. She must have felt invincible, confident that her secret was safe, because she didn't detect the cold resolve growing inside me. I knew what I had to do, but it would take patience and precision. The morning after my discovery was quiet. Molly went through her usual routine, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath my surface. I watched her sip her coffee, flip through her emails, smile at nothing in particular, and felt the bitterness rise up within me. Every gesture, every laugh, every casual glance felt like a performance. She had no idea that the curtain was about to drop. I had decided I wouldn't confront her, not yet. I wanted to understand the full scope of her betrayal, to know exactly how much of our life was a lie. To start, I needed more proof, more than just the texts. I didn't want there to be any doubt left when the time came. I wanted her to feel the weight of every single lie she'd told, every excuse she'd made, every whisper she'd shared with Nick. The first part of my plan was simple: surveillance. Over the next few days, I went online, researched apps that could sync her phone's data to mine. It wasn't difficult to set up. After years of working in tech, I knew the tools and tricks well enough. It was amazing how much she trusted me, even as she deceived me, enough to leave her phone unlocked in my presence. By the end of the week, I was able to see her messages in real time. Every notification, every call, every small interaction with Nick was at my fingertips. It was painful, but the pain only sharpened my resolve. Each evening, she would come home and act as though everything was perfectly fine. She would tell me about her day, complain about her boss, or joke about her coworkers. Sometimes, she even mentioned Nick, telling me stories about how he'd accidentally messed up a spreadsheet or stumbled over his words in a meeting. I'd nod along, feigning interest, biting back the anger that burned through me. The messages painted a different picture entirely. While she acted like nothing was amiss, her conversations with Nick revealed a growing intimacy. Their texts were flirtatious, their plans more elaborate. They shared jokes, reminisced about previous meetings, and spoke in that familiar way reserved for lovers. Reading those texts felt like pouring salt into an open wound, but I forced myself to endure it. Every message fueled my determination to make her pay for every single betrayal. One evening, she told me she had to work late. I watched her dress in a way that was far too thoughtful for a simple night at the office, her best blouse, a pair of heels I knew she wore only on special occasions. I played along, wishing her a good night, even smiling as I handed her the car keys. As soon as she left, I opened the tracking app on my phone. She wasn't going to her office, she was headed across town, straight to Nick's apartment. In that moment, I wanted to drive over there, to bang on his door and demand answers. But I held back. A confrontation now would be too easy, too messy. She needed to feel her own betrayal, to be left with no one to turn to when the truth finally came out. The next part of my plan took a little more planning. I'd been working on it quietly, making preparations and setting things in motion without raising her suspicions. I began by booking a family gathering, an event where all our friends, close family, and even a few of her coworkers would be present. I went through the guest list carefully, making sure it included everyone who meant something to her, and to me. This would be the stage for my revelation, a chance for her to face the consequences in front of those who cared about us both. The morning of the gathering arrived, and I could tell Molly was surprised by the sudden celebration. I spun it as a late anniversary event, a chance to celebrate our years together with friends and family. She seemed touched, even a little guilty, which almost made me laugh. She had no idea what was really waiting for her. I made sure every detail was perfect. I hired a catering company, set up a beautiful outdoor space in our backyard, complete with tables, twinkling lights, and music. It looked like the kind of celebration we'd once enjoyed together, back when I believed in our future. But tonight, it wasn't about the future, it was about exposing the truth. When Molly and I greeted the guests, she was all smiles, her hand resting in mine as she laughed and chatted with everyone. I watched her play the part of the devoted wife, the woman who had everything she could ever want. Seeing her bask in that glow, utterly unaware, gave me a grim satisfaction. Tonight would strip away the illusions. As the evening wore on, I kept an eye on my watch, waiting for the right moment. I made sure everyone had eaten, that drinks were flowing, and that people were comfortably settled. At some point, Molly drifted away, likely to check her phone. Sure enough, I saw her sneaking a message to Nick. I knew what was coming next. She'd likely disappear for a while to take a call or grab something from the car. But I was ready. I had planned for a specific time to make my move. I found a quiet spot by the main table and tapped my glass, drawing the attention of everyone around us. Molly was still nowhere in sight, and I took that moment to address our guests. "Thank you all for coming," I began, watching as everyone quieted down. "It means a lot to us to celebrate this day with friends and family." A few people clinked glasses, and I saw Molly returning, looking slightly flushed. She glanced at me, confused, wondering why I was speaking. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to see the smile fade from her face. "I know some of you have known Molly and me for years. We've shared so much, laughs, tears, memories." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "And tonight, I want to share one more thing, something that's been difficult to keep to myself." A silence fell over the crowd, and Molly's eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to steady herself on a chair. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I motioned toward the back, where I'd arranged a final surprise. The door swung open, and in walked Nick, who I had invited, claiming it was a work function and that Molly would be thrilled to see him. He'd been more than willing to attend, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. Molly's face drained of color as she saw him. For a split second, I thought she might try to deny it, to make up some excuse, but as the whispers rippled through the room, she realized there was no way out. She looked at me, pleading silently, but I held her gaze, cold and unmoving. Without saying a word, I took my things, turned, and walked out of the party, leaving her to face the fallout. The cool evening air hit me as I stepped outside, the muffled sound of murmurs and gasps fading as I distanced myself from the gathering. I didn't look back. I wanted to remember that moment, the shocked expression on Molly's face, the way her voice had caught in her throat, her eyes darting to Nick in disbelief. In that single moment, she'd been exposed for who she truly was, and I'd finally put down the weight of my suspicions and doubts. I felt strangely free. I sat in the car for a moment, taking a few deep breaths, letting the satisfaction wash over me. I had spent months agonizing over what she had done, wondering how I could possibly make her feel even a fraction of the betrayal I'd experienced. Now, she'd have to pick up the shattered pieces of her carefully constructed lie in front of everyone she cared about. There was no turning back for her now. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see her name flashing on the screen. I let it ring. I wasn't ready to hear her frantic explanations, the inevitable string of excuses. But then the texts started coming, one after another. "Please, pick up. I need to talk to you. It's not what it looks like." I scoffed at that last one. After everything I'd read, everything I'd seen, how could she even think that I'd believe it wasn't what it looked like? But I knew why she was saying it. It was easier for her to pretend there was some logical explanation, something that would make it all seem less damning. For so long, she'd been weaving this web of deceit, and now she was desperately grasping at any way to salvage it. I put the car in drive and headed to a hotel I'd booked for the night. I knew that going home would only end in another confrontation, one I didn't feel like having yet. I needed to process everything, to be alone, to think about what I wanted next. The thrill of the reveal had left me in a strange state of calm, but I knew it was temporary. Soon enough, the pain and anger would resurface, and I'd have to face the reality of our marriage's end. After checking in, I collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the night catching up with me. Staring at the ceiling, I replayed the events in my mind, recalling each detail of her reaction. The way her face had paled, the panic in her eyes, the way Nick had looked equally dumbfounded, completely unaware that I had set him up as well. He'd walked right into it, too confident to suspect that I knew everything. As I lay there, my phone buzzed again. I glanced over, seeing a string of messages from Molly. "I'm sorry. Please talk to me. You're overreacting. It was just a mistake." The anger bubbled up again. Just a mistake. That's what she wanted to call this. A mistake was forgetting to take out the trash or missing a birthday, not carrying on an affair right under my nose, betraying our vows, our history, our life together. Her attempts to minimize it only reminded me how delusional she must have been to think she could hide it forever. Finally, I couldn't resist. I picked up the phone and texted her back. "Was it a mistake every time you met up with him? Or just tonight when you got caught?" A long pause followed before the three little dots appeared on the screen, indicating that she was typing. I could imagine her sitting there, struggling to come up with a response that would make this all go away. "It wasn't like that," she finally replied. "It was just complicated. I didn't want to hurt you." The audacity of her words hit me like a slap. She didn't want to hurt me. Every word she typed seemed to dig her deeper into a hole, making me see her more clearly for the manipulative person she'd become. "If you didn't want to hurt me, you wouldn't have lied to me for months," I wrote back. "You wouldn't have brought him into our life, pretended everything was fine, and expected me to just accept it." Her next message came quickly, the desperation palpable even through the screen. "I know I messed up. But we can fix this. Please, just come home so we can talk about it." I knew what she was trying to do, pull me back, reel me in, hoping that enough words and apologies would make me reconsider. But it was too late for that. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied coldly. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." After that, I silenced my phone and set it aside. I couldn't bear to read any more of her pleas, her attempts to salvage what was left of our relationship. I knew she'd keep trying, that she'd find ways to rationalize what she'd done, to twist the narrative in her favor. But I was done playing along. The next morning, I woke up to find over a dozen missed calls and a flood of texts from her. Some were angry, others were desperate, but all of them were futile. She'd shattered whatever trust we had, and I couldn't see a way back. I drove back home later that afternoon, determined to clear my head and figure out my next steps. The house was empty when I arrived, and the silence was almost comforting. I walked through each room, looking at the remnants of our life together, the photos on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken, the small things that had once meant so much. Now, each one felt like a reminder of a life that no longer existed. As I was packing a few things, the door swung open, and there she was, standing in the doorway, looking disheveled, her eyes red and puffy. "Please, can we talk?" she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to talk, but part of me knew that this conversation was inevitable. I motioned for her to sit down, and she took a seat on the couch, wringing her hands nervously. "I'm sorry," she started. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." I said nothing, letting her sit with the silence. She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering to the floor. I never wanted it to go this far, she continued. It was just. Nick made me feel alive, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But I never meant to hurt you. You didn't mean to hurt me. I repeated, my voice flat. You lied to me, deceived me for months, and yet somehow, you didn't mean to hurt me. Her face crumpled, and she nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I know it sounds stupid. I don't know how to explain it. There's nothing to explain, Molly. You wanted excitement, something different, and you didn't care who you hurt to get it. She winced, but I didn't let up. I trusted you, Molly. I thought we had something real, something worth fighting for. But you threw it all away. And now, you want me to believe that it was just a mistake. That somehow it didn't mean anything. She reached out to take my hand, but I pulled back, the gesture too painful to bear. I love you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never stopped loving you. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You don't do this to someone you love, Molly. Love doesn't look like this. She bit her lip, struggling to hold back tears. I'll do anything to make this right. We can go to counseling, whatever you want. Just please, don't walk away. But I knew, deep down, that it was already over. Her promises, her apologies, they were just words, empty and meaningless after everything that had happened. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. You made your choice, and now, I'm making mine. Her face crumpled as she realized the finality of my words. She reached for me, pleading, but I turned away, walking out the door and leaving her there, broken and alone, just as she had left me in all but name so many months ago. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a sense of closure, a peace that I hadn't felt in weeks. I had faced the truth, confronted the lies, and freed myself from a marriage that had become a prison. The life we had was gone, and all that was left was a blank slate, a chance to rebuild, to start over. And as painful as it was, I knew it was the right choice. As I drove away from the house, a strange emptiness settled in. It wasn't the relief I'd expected after cutting ties with Molly. Instead, it felt like I was hollowed out, left adrift. I had severed the ties of a life I'd once held so close, and now, the weight of finality sat heavy on me. Part of me wanted to keep driving, leave the city, leave everything behind, but I knew that wasn't the answer. I had a life here, however fractured it was at the moment, and I had to face whatever came next. I pulled over to a quiet park a few miles away, letting the silence around me calm the storm within. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes, trying to imagine what a life without Molly would look like. Just as I was beginning to let the calm wash over me, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, thinking it would be another message from her, another futile attempt to sway me. But it wasn't. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and my first instinct was to ignore it. But something about it felt wrong. I answered, cautiously. Hello. A woman's voice came through the line, slightly hesitant but urgent. Is this Will? Yes, this is Will. Who's this? There was a pause. I don't know how to tell you this, but, my name is Sarah. I think we need to talk about our spouses. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She hesitated again, and I could almost hear her bracing herself on the other end of the line. I'm Nick's wife. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Nick had a wife. I didn't know whether to feel shocked, angry, or vindicated, but a new question quickly surfaced. How much did she know? What are you saying? I managed. I found out a few months ago, Sarah said, her voice thick with the same pain I'd been feeling. About him and your wife. I didn't know if I should reach out or if it was my place, but then I saw you at that party last night. And when I saw you leave, I thought, maybe you didn't know. No, I didn't know. Not until recently, I replied, my throat tight. How did you find out? She sighed. He's always been careless. I was suspicious for a long time. His lies were getting sloppy, his stories didn't add up, and he was getting distant. I started checking his phone, his messages. That's when I found everything. He was so blatant about it, like he didn't think anyone would ever find out. I nodded, not that she could see it. I know what that's like. Molly was the same. She thought I'd never notice, that I'd just believe whatever she said. And for a long time, I did. There was a long silence between us, both of us processing the strange solidarity of betrayal that we'd just discovered. We had been living parallel lives, two strangers bound by the lies of our spouses, neither of us knowing the other existed until now. I don't know why I called, Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I just wanted to know if someone else understood what this felt like. But now that we've spoken, I realize I was hoping for more. That maybe we could do something about this. A part of me wanted to end the call right there, to put this whole mess behind me and move on. But the other part, the part that still felt raw and restless, wanted answers, wanted closure. And maybe this was the way to get it. What did you have in mind? I asked, my voice steady but curious. Sarah's voice grew sharper, more determined. They think they're untouchable. They think they can walk all over us, destroy our lives, and move on. But they shouldn't get to walk away without facing the consequences. For the next hour, we stayed on the phone, plotting and strategizing, building a plan that would make sure Molly and Nick wouldn't forget us anytime soon. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I didn't know what would come of this, but it was something. A way to make sense of the madness they'd left us with. A few days later, we put our plan into motion. Sarah and I had agreed to keep things simple but effective. It started with Sarah reaching out to Nick with a carefully crafted message, one that hinted at knowing more than he'd ever told her, a suggestion that she might be willing to forgive him if he came clean about everything. Meanwhile, I approached Molly with a similar proposition, suggesting that maybe we could work through things if she told me the full story. The responses were instant. Both Nick and Molly panicked, floundering as they tried to cover their tracks, unsure of what we knew and desperate to regain control. They each tried to call us, text us, weaving a web of explanations and half-truths, hoping to salvage whatever was left. But we didn't bite. Then came the final phase of our plan, the recording. Sarah and I had agreed to meet in a neutral location with Molly and Nick, under the pretense of discussing potential reconciliation. They thought they'd be able to spin their lies one last time, to convince us to come back, or at least to leave them in peace. But what they didn't know was that we were working together. We'd rented a small conference room in a hotel, claiming it would be a safe space for honest discussion, and set up discreet recording devices around the room to capture every word. When the day came, Molly and Nick arrived separately, each looking nervous and disheveled, as if they'd barely slept. I noticed the way they glanced at each other, a flicker of unease in their eyes. I could see the gears turning in their heads, the uncertainty creeping in. I was seated next to Sarah, who maintained a calm, neutral expression, playing her part perfectly. We let them speak first. They stammered through apologies, offering excuses, pleading for forgiveness. Nick kept glancing at Sarah, his words hollow, desperate, while Molly fixed her gaze on me, her eyes wide, willing me to believe her. They twisted their stories, trying to downplay the affair, to paint it as a mistake rather than a deliberate betrayal. After about an hour, Sarah finally spoke up, her voice steely and unyielding. So let me get this straight. You're both sorry, and it was all just a terrible mistake. They nodded, relief flickering across their faces. But Sarah wasn't finished. Good. Because we wanted to make sure we heard you say that clearly. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small device. She pressed a button, and a recording began to play. The sound of their voices, every sordid detail of their affair, filled the room. Each word was crystal clear, leaving no room for denial or evasion. Molly's face went white, her mouth hanging open as she realized what was happening. Nick looked just as horrified, his hands clenching into fists as he stared at Sarah in disbelief. "We know everything," I said, my voice calm but laced with satisfaction. "And now, so will everyone else." As they sat there, stunned into silence, I pulled out my phone and sent the recording to several people in our lives, their families, close friends, colleagues. It was brutal, but it was also the truth, and they had no one to blame but themselves. After that, Sarah and I left the room without a backward glance, leaving them to face the reality they'd created. We didn't speak as we walked out of the hotel, but as we reached the parking lot, Sarah turned to me, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I don't know about you," she said, "but I feel better." I chuckled, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in months. "Yeah. Me too." We parted ways, each of us going back to our own lives, but as I got into my car, I couldn't help but feel that maybe this was the start of something new. A new chapter, unburdened by the lies and deceit of the past. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.